Hello, this is James Barkell.
And it is wonderful to have your company here on the centre court.
You are listening to the Coach Doctor podcast.
Strikes it beautifully and it's down the middle.
In this podcast series, we discuss all things coaching and sports science.
Beats one, beats a couple, still going.
Each episode will feature prominent coaches on the front line of their sport.
Across to Mbappe.
As well as some of the world's leading university academics who research what it takes to get the W.
All Blacks under big pressure again.
If there is an aspect of your coaching that needs some assistance, you can always count on the Coach Doctor to add life to your program.
Browning's having a terrific run. The first three to qualify. You betcha!
In this episode of the Coach Doctor podcast, I speak to Associate Professor Andrew Bennie. Andrew's PhD research investigated effective coaching in professional sports contexts. From the research, he developed an effective coaching model which includes three core components. 1, the coach and their personal characteristics and philosophy. 2, coaching skills such as leadership, communication, planning and people management. And 3, the environment, which should be positive and have a strong sense of team culture. More recently, Andrew's research has focused on collaborating with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sports coaches from a variety of team sports and individual sports in community and high-performance settings from all over Australia to share their stories about pathways into and experiences when in coaching roles. These stories form the basis for the recently published book called Aboriginal Sports Coaches, Community and Culture. Andrew was also part of a team of researchers, Aboriginal coaches and National Sports Organisation representatives that co-created the Coaching Unlimited program, a national coach education program designed to provide specific coach accreditation pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches in a variety of sports. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Andrew Bennie. Hi Andrew, welcome to the podcast today. Can you tell me a little bit about where you are and a bit about your background?
Yeah, no worries, James. Glad to be here. And before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm sitting here on Wallumbadagal lands, and it's a beautiful country, home of the snapper fish. And I just want to pay respects to the elders past, present and future, especially given it's the first time we're catching up on your podcast and we're talking a little bit about some of the work I've done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches across this nation, and just acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be listening to this podcast and thank them for sharing their wisdom over the years with me through any educative means. It's been wonderful to be a part of their community through this work. And look, the work that I do is at university, and connected to that is teaching and learning, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people share knowledge orally, which is what we're doing today, sharing it through story. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this. Speaking about my work, I work at Western Sydney Uni. I'm a academic in the health and physical education program / sport development degree. And I've been working at Western for 10 or 11 years. And prior to that, did a PhD at Sydney Uni. So it's been wonderful to be a part of it here at Western. Great organisation and place to work.
So you just mentioned prior to working there, you did your PhD. What made you interested in researching and completing a PhD in the area of sports coaching?
I think I've always loved sport and trained as a health and PE teacher originally, but I suppose I was fortunate enough to do a bit of research in my undergrad degree before I went out into the world of teaching, and I taught for a couple of years, but always knew that I wanted to come back and do a bit more learning. Had a great experience with my initial research project. And so caught up with Donna O'Connor, a professor at Sydney Uni, who helped shape some ideas around what further research might look like. And so, in discussion with her, she being my supervisor in the end for the PhD, we crafted a really basic topic around effective coaching. I enjoyed coaching a little bit more than teaching, because I think there's a little bit more freedom in coaching, and you've got to focus on improving people, individuals, a team within the context or confines of a season. So I guess I wanted to learn a little bit more about that, and being interested in learning, I always have this drive to find out what makes people effective or do things well, or what they believe is successful, to sort of learn from that and then apply in my own context. So we wanted to keep the topic as broad as possible and try and uncover from that professional setting what people thought effective coaching was meant to be, what it looked like, what people did, whether that matched reality. And it was as simple as that. It wasn't about testing a theory. It wasn't about going into it with preconceived ideas. It was simply a matter of taking the context of professional sport as one where you consider the highest level of performances in a particular sporting context. And so what's their understanding of what effective coaching looks like in that world? That was the basic premise of the project. And my own background in sport was achieving quite a good level as a school student, but not really being able to go on through injury and other things, yet still wanting to remain connected in some way to the elite high performance sports world. And I could only do it through research because I wasn't going anywhere with coaching. I was coaching at school level, but also, competing wise, I had to give up on that fairly early. So research was a great way to become more involved with the high performance world, which I was most interested in.
Yeah, great. So tell me a little bit about the organisations or the sports that you work with during your research.
Yeah, there were professional sports organisations at the provincial level. The three sports were cricket, rugby union and rugby league. I can't really be much more specific than that, just for ethical reasons. But needless to say, each of the teams that I'd worked with had coaches who'd experienced some level of outcome success in terms of winning a competition in some form, or training people up to be in national level teams. So they were in a good position to comment about what they thought made them effective in their professional sports individually. And it was a good balance because cricket's quite a different sport to rugby union and rugby league. And even there's quite a difference between, the social side of things in terms of rugby league and rugby union. So I was trying to get as diverse a perspective as I possibly could from those particular sporting contexts. And knowing that at the time when I started this research back in 2005, there really wasn't any definitive level of female professional sports that we could go out and explore in the same way. There was a lot of semi-professional things going on, but nothing that was as formalized and as well structured as we see now in some of the mainstream sports. So we focused on men's professional sports at the provincial level. So in terms of gathering data, for anybody who might be thinking about going into research in the future or interested in what, gathering data looks like when you're doing a PhD or any form of research, how did you gather information for your research findings? I think this is one of the best aspects of the project and something I've tried to replicate since but haven't been able to do. I basically set it up so I could go in and observe what coaches do. So we had some visual representation of what perceived effectiveness might look like, but also talk to a variety of people in the organisation so that it wasn't just coming from the coach's perspective. And so I ended up interviewing athletes and coaches who were head coaches or assistant coaches. So the summary is I'd go in and observe training sessions, team meetings, review meetings, as much as I was allowed to go into to collect data. And then I'd sit down and try and organise a one-on-one catch up with the head coach, then the assistant coach, and do a focus group with some of the players, any of the players that were interested. And the reality was that it wasn't about testing or evaluating the head coach's performance. It was about getting their own individual understanding of what effectiveness meant. So the head coach might have had a different perspective from the assistant coach. The players might have had different perspectives about effective coaching than the head coach or the assistant. And my job was to try and bring that information together in a manageable, consumable and understandable way. But it was so enjoyable to be a part of each team. I had 1 month with each team to get to see how they operated and take notes about the way they spoke, coaches to players and back players up to coaches during training, how they structured training sessions. And being a teacher, I was really interested in the way that they plan their sessions and what they look like on the field. So it was an incredible opportunity, and really made doing the research so enjoyable and satisfying.
It would have been awesome. So were the coaches pretty accommodating in terms of the access that they gave you to the team? You said you were with each team for 1 month. Was it pretty much like you were a member of the team for a month?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could make it to something, they were happy to have me there. I mean, there were some, I think, kind of private things that they didn't invite me to, but I had enough access to different types of meetings, and whole days at cricket, sitting in the change room, to being a part of the coach's box during a rugby union game. So it would have been great to be there with a whole season for each of them, but it was enough time to get a sense of what was going on, to see some patterns of how they structured things like weekly training, the way that they went from game review to planning training to running training sessions to communicating feedback, role division between coaches and players in terms of running training sessions. So it was a fascinating insight, and a good chance to see at that time how professional coaching was also evolving, not just in relation to the literature, but what you heard in mainstream media. It was at the time where there was this emergence of athlete leadership in teams, and groups of athletes leading their teams, not just having sole captains, more empowerment towards players for decision making. So I think it was a good time to be conducting this research, to start to collate some evidence about what professional coaches were doing. Again, 2005 was still probably only 10 or 20 years after a lot of the sports started becoming much more professional. With respect to coaching, sure, athletes, that was probably a little bit long before that in some of the sports, but the professionalization of coaching in this sort of setting probably wasn't much before when we started doing this research. And there certainly wasn't research of this kind at that point in time, in terms of balancing the observations with the interviews.
So from your research, you then developed what you've named the effective coaching model. And I'm going to display this on my Instagram page. But essentially it comprises of 3 overarching concepts that need to continuously interact with the other concepts. Can you explain these concepts? And I know we're going to talk more in depth later on about some of the specific studies, but could you explain these and how they relate to each other?
Yeah, so I guess this is what the athletes and coaches perceive to be effective. And realistically, what I suppose one of the most fundamental things is that the coach's perspective or perceptions of what is effective needs to match the athlete's perceptions of what is effective in order for it to work well, to be successful, to have the coaching effectively, let's say, and leading to potentially positive outcomes on the field, but most importantly off the field as well. And I think we can see that in the recent situation with the Australian cricket team, where if you read into the media, what they're saying is that the coach had one perspective about what was effective. The athletes had another perspective. They didn't match up. So now the coach has got the boot. The athletes have kind of got the power. And I think that's where, if they're not on the same page in terms of the process of coaching and how things work and the team environment, the way that you communicate, then it's going to be very difficult to achieve any level of effectiveness or success in that coaching environment. I say that the Australian cricket team's been very successful of late, but in terms of the principles of coaching, it would be quite difficult. The other thing to keep in mind is that these findings are based on those 3 very specific contexts. So it's really up to people themselves to apply these principles in the way that they think may or may not work, or may work in their context, but it might not work everywhere. So we had basically, the coach as a person, what are they like? What are their personal characteristics, and what's their underpinning philosophy? How do they approach their coaching? This connects to their own skills and background, what they've learnt in terms of coaching, how they might have been coached, what they've done in terms of their own professional development, and that sort of translates into how they lead the team, communicate with the team, how they manage people within the team, how they plan their training sessions, and ultimately this all interacts in the environment that they create. So the environment, not just being on a training field, that's the culture of the team as well. So all of those interact, what the coach is like a person, to how they communicate and lead the team, to the way that they develop and continue to improve their team culture, teams or team sports in this setting. All of those are always interacting so that there's a level of perceived effectiveness amongst the group. I think like the key things, what really stood out to me in terms of the research was that first and foremost, these coaches at the professional level focused far more on player management and developing a team culture than they did on the X's and O's, the tactics, the strategies. And absolutely, that was a core component of it. But at the time, back in 2005, that was a really surprising thing to hear, because I thought at the professional level, that's probably something they'd focus on more than anything else, is wins and losses. Therefore, tactics and strategies and technique development in order to produce effective athletes who can win games. And there's absolutely no question that's a part of it. But these coaches spoke far more about this concept, which was very new to me and wasn't really in the literature, of people management. And that came down to what now we see commonly being spoken about in professional coach rhetoric, professional athlete rhetoric. They've got to get to know me as an individual. They've got to understand my individual needs. The coach has to manage the individual needs. That might be the personal circumstances, religious, cultural affiliations. It might be their familial circumstances. They might be younger athletes, more experienced athletes, but the coach has got to understand those needs, bring them together as part of a team, and navigate that throughout a season, the ups and downs of what people go through. So, the focus on understanding individuals, but also developing them as people, not just players. And again, that concept was really foreign at that time. I think because there was, what we tended to understand was this focus on, no, it's about winning and losing and nothing else. So to hear them speak first about developing the person, then the player, at that time was quite unique. Whereas now, that's kind of, again, it's something that people say a lot, coach organizations are aware of, but I'm not sure they're always doing the best job at developing those skills in coaches, because, in some situations, coach education, particularly in the early levels, tends to focus on rules, requirements, techniques, tactics, and strategies, and they're really important. But as you know, coaching is a highly personal thing. So interpersonal relationships and communication are really, really critical. So I think, they were the things that really stood out as like the critical things for coaching effectiveness at that level.
Did you find that was across the board?
It was each of the head and assistant coaches in those contexts really emphasized that, but the players also supported those ideas. They were saying, to understand me as a person. And I was interviewing someone who was 32, 33, had a couple of kids at home, next to someone who was 20 and just starting out. They were both saying the same thing, but obviously the needs of that 32-year-old with a couple of kids would be quite different than the 20-year-old in terms of how they approach their sporting experience. But the head coach in cricket, he spoke about the importance of developing the person, but also leadership skills in the athletes, because basically when they get on the field, the coaches, they just do nothing. They don't do anything for 6 or 7 contact at breaks, but there's not as frequent breaks. It's not as short a game as other sports. Rugby union, absolutely, they're bringing together people from various different cultures in their context. Same with rugby league. But the piece there was much about, coaching this group of people to work cohesively together by understanding what their individual needs were and helping the athletes to meet their needs as much as the team's needs. And the rugby league coach, he sort of spoke to the fact that if you can't get people working on the same page through understanding their different needs, interests, goals, then it'd be very hard to be effective in terms of how you're translating messages. Will they be receptive to them? Will that lead to that on-field success that everyone's craving? It was, I suppose the summary is, it was a real developmental focus, right? Coach the person first, try and help them improve in order to have team success, rather than find whatever best strategy there is to win games and then translate that down to people and make them do what you need in order to win. And I thought that was fascinating at the highest level of sport that you could play at in a professional competition in Australia. At the time, 2007 it was when I was collecting this data.
Yeah, wow. So I guess that leads into the next question around coaching philosophy. So I've spoken to a lot of coaches about coaching philosophy, and there tends to be a little bit of a mixed idea of what a coaching philosophy means. In your study, how did you define a coaching philosophy? And it might be completely different, I guess, from how we perceive it in the actual coaching world.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that's also different to how some people perceive it in the academic world. I went into this with a really simple idea of what makes a coach effective. And one of the questions was about how do you approach coaching? And that could be related to a philosophy. It could be related to values, personal, whatever other things might shape values. But I simply asked, what is your approach? How do you go about your coaching? What underpins everything that you do? And if that's a philosophy, describe that for me. The interesting thing is that I got really critiqued by some academics in the literature for what the word philosophy actually means. They went into that field of study called philosophy and shared that we weren't doing that. Again, that wasn't my purpose. I never framed this as something that was going to be a study of philosophy. It just so happened that that was a good way to describe how the coaches approached their coaching and what they believed was an effective way, what values underpinned the way that they coached. And I think actually what we found was probably more applicable to the world of coaching than academia. And that was always my intent, to have something that could be shared with students that I taught, with the public in some way, or with coaching organizations, so that they can start to reshape and reframe their mindset from X and O's and wins and losses, the most important thing, to actually people matter the most, the way that people coach matters most. And while that might have been a category of coaching skills and people management, the philosophy is what underpins how they valued people, their players, how they treated with them, and how they treated them, and how they communicated with them. So to me, it was about what they believed, how they led, what standards they set with the players, how they managed the group and situations, whether they were coaching to everyone, to the top group, middle group, or bottom group, people developing. So, the philosophy ended up being just what drove everything they did in their coaching world, organizationally, in relations with people who worked at the organization, media, players, their families. Their coaching philosophy underpin or related to all of the things that they did in their field of coaching, not just on the field.
Yeah. So again, and it goes back to, I think, the way you explained the coach effectiveness model. It's not just about the tactical strategies. It's not just about we want to play an attacking brand of football or that sort of thing. It's more about the interpersonal relationships. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Part of what they do is have a certain philosophy towards their sport. They might be more attacking coaches or more defensive. That's part of their philosophy. But when they were describing what their philosophy meant to them in terms of being an effective coach, it always related to that interpersonal side of things more than other things. So how they related to the players, how they related to their families, how they related to people within the organization, assistant coaches, trainers, how they treated people who brought the gear each week. They always spoke to things beyond the individual person and factors that were going to influence their team environment. And again, I think that was really surprising, that there was such a limited focus. It was almost like it was blasé, we've got to be knowledgeable and we've got to understand the rules and techniques and tactics and be at the forefront of emerging technology. But what they spoke most about was this philosophical approach to leading teams, or to building a team culture that's centered around their relationships with other people, in the team and in the organization. Which was really pleasing and different, I think.
Yeah. So one of the words, I guess, that really stood out to me in one of your papers is the word humanistic approach. So does a humanistic approach basically define what you've just been talking about in terms of developing the interpersonal relationships first before the technical aspects of their sports?
Simple answer is yes. And from a coaching point of view, yes, in academia, they've got lots of different theories about humanistic coaching, but fundamentally it ties back to that person first mentality or approach towards coaching. If I can first address that person's needs, treat them as an individual, how they might fit in with the team environment, then I'm going to be doing a better job as a coach. And the technical and tactical side of things, I'll have a better understanding of what they want to do in the technical and tactical side of things that I've got to translate into a team performance on the training field and on the weekend in a game.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, do you think it's easier to have this sort of approach in the elite environment than in a, let's say, a Tuesday, Thursday night team training, like club, like social club sort of team? They're still playing to win games and stuff, but they train 2 nights a week for an hour and a half each session, and then they play on the weekend. Do you think it's hard to fit that humanistic approach into that sort of short social model?
I think this is a great one to sit on the fence for, because in some ways the professional environment has the luxury of these highly talented athletes whose skills you still have to develop and improve to an extent, but they come with so much experience and quality in terms of that playing area that you probably have more time to spend on trying to focus on the person. And in the end, you have more time with them in general because you see them, 6 days a week or whatever it might be. So in some ways, yes, but then again, if you're coaching a team a couple of times a week and on the weekend, I think if you get to understand what's happening in their worlds outside, it'll only help you create a better environment for the 2 touch points a week before a game. So really, I think it's a mentality. It's about, what are you valuing when you go to coaching? Are you valuing the 2 hours you've got for just getting in as much as you can in terms of technical, tactical development for the game? Or are you trying to develop them not just as players, but as a person, and get to know them and build that relationship so that they'll feel more comfortable, safe, and perform better by the time it gets to the weekend, because you've focused on them as a human being as much as you have them as a player. And again, like if you take that step back to what coach education knows, maybe currently values still a bit more, it's that focus on trying to give them content knowledge to be able to understand a sport, as opposed to giving them deeper understanding at whatever level, foundation level, at the high performance level, of the importance of interpersonal relationships, communication skills, ways of leading, bringing teams together. Whereas, you can pick up some of that technical, tactical development along the way. We might be seeing some transitions. I think it's not like the world of coach education is asleep on this. They know it. It's just, it's hard. There's not a lot of money to kind of really reinvigorate things all the time.
Yeah, definitely. But do you think that could be something that coach education systems could improve on, in terms of putting a little bit more time into dealing with the person, as well as the technical, tactical aspects of the sports?
I think so. Particularly with technology, because there's lots of information available online regarding, what drill is good, what activity is good, what sort of game-based situation you might create to learn a particular skill. And sometimes it's just sifting through that information that people don't have time for, whereas, the sport organisation could set that up. Because lots of people come to sport and sports coaching with their own knowledge and background in that sport. So in some ways you can rely on that and then shape them as a coach by focusing on the person. But if you think about parents who have never had an interest in sport or never coached a sport, and they go to get some coach education, well, they may need that content knowledge about the particular rules, tactics, techniques, strategies in a particular sport that current sports organizations tend to focus on. So it's a difficult position for them to be in. But I think it would be worthwhile to invest more in helping people understand how to connect individuals to each other, to build that positive environment to learn in, because I think that would serve better as a starting point. And then along the way in the season, you can pick up your drills and skills and tactical activities and ways to coach within the remit of the game as the season progresses. Yeah, I mean, and it'd be interesting to hear other people's perspectives about that, whether they agree or disagree, and perhaps getting someone from a sport organisation on to get their take, who works in coach education. They might have something totally different to say about it too.
No, definitely. So in some of the other aspects you looked at, and it might all be crossing over, was firstly leadership. You looked at leadership aspects of effective coaches. What were some of the key findings there? Again, did that generally lead back towards relationships, or was there something extra that stood out around leadership?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of interesting things again at the time. In reading the literature and having a bit of an understanding of teaching, there tended to be this focus on the sage on the stage. I'm the teacher, therefore I know. I'm the coach, therefore I know. And what I say is important. You need to listen. But there was this real trend within the interviews and what I was observing to empowering athletes to do certain things. The coaches spoke openly about trying to empower athletes to take more responsibility for their learning and development when they're on a training field and outside the training field as well. So, I came in at a time where video analysis was hot. Lots of people were doing it well. They'd cut clips and send them to players. Again, it's just all common practice now, but in that professional setting. But they would use that as a communication point. They'd ask the players to find strengths and weaknesses in what they do. They'd meet about it. The coach would give their perspective. They'd come together with a goal or an action plan for training for that individual to work on. They do the same thing as a team. What are our weaknesses? What do we need to work on? Plan that out. So I think empowering the players to be able to do some of their own learning on their own, individually, outside scheduled training hours. There was a level of empowerment in terms of developing what the team stood for. So again, like that athlete leadership approach, in various different ways, it was orchestrated through, right, who are the leaders in our team? What are the behaviors that they value, they do, that we value as a team? Rate each person the most to vote them in as the captains of the team or in that leadership group. Okay, now we've got a leadership group. What are the things that are going to be sort of the rules and regulations and what we accept and don't accept in terms of behavioral standards? It wasn't just words in terms of this is what we want to be. This is our vision. It was the vision that tied in with actual behaviors that fed into that. And what the coaches said was it was their job to help cultivate that with the players, but the players were the ones that drove it. And the coaches just had to facilitate and make sure that players sort of stuck to it. So in the end, what happened was that each of the coaches and their assistants ended up having players who were like assistant coaches anyway. And they were players that other players respected because they'd voted them in for whatever reasons. And so, you've got that communication channel now. You can go to that leadership group and say, what's happening with these blokes? I've noticed they're off. And the players go, yeah, they're having this issue or they don't like this. So, there was that two-way communication that was really open and honest. And I think it was an interesting time to kind of learn about that empowerment of athletes, empowerment of coaches as well. One of the coaches said something really interesting, which again, like you wouldn't hear many coaches, I don't think, admitting to this type of thing, but particularly at the professional level. But he said, look, I don't know everything. And where I've got weaknesses, what I've tried to do is employ people who can fill those gaps in knowledge or weaknesses that I might have so that we've got everything covered. And you might think about like, if a forward gets employed as the head coach of a rugby union team, their understanding what the backs might do might be okay, but you want to get a backs coach to fill that void, or someone with really good defensive capabilities. They don't know as much attack, or they'll employ someone who can coach attack. And that makes sense. But it was surprising to hear a coach kind of admit a lack of knowledge. You'd think they should or would know everything at that level. But that was, again, that was the nature of this coach. She was so open with everything. It was quite incredible.
Yeah, I guess that brings me to the next question. Again, it's around relationships, but we've talked about the coach-athlete relationship. Was that the same between like the head coach, the assistant coach? Did they have the same, did they have the same sorts of relationships, or was the head coach a little bit different? I guess speaking from experience, a lot of teams I've been involved in, the head coaches had a little bit more of that, I don't know how you'd say it, a little bit more of a leadership role, whereas the assistant coaches might be a little bit more friendly with the players and have a little bit more of a relationship, a little bit more of a friendly relationship. Does that make sense?
Depended on the context. So I think the head coach of the rugby team basically empowered his assistants to run training sessions. The head coach had oversight, made all the decisions, but empowered his assistants to run training sessions in areas of their strength, and naturally that led to a stronger connection with the players through high levels of interaction. Didn't mean that the head coach didn't spend time with the players one-on-one or meet with them where necessary, or pull them out of training and give them a little bit of feedback. And the cricket coach was probably fairly similar. The head coach of the rugby league team was far more hands-on. So he, as much as he was overseeing and leading everything, still got involved and ran training sessions and forged a really strong relationship with his players. So I think it can be done differently in whatever context. And it probably comes down to the individual as well and what they value. Do they feel like they've got to be more than arm's length to create that professional distance in order to better educate, get better outcomes, or do they feel like an arm's length relationship, professional as well as personal, is going to cultivate that environment that's going to create the best learning? And of course, each of them talked about not crossing the line in terms of personal, going too far, going out with them, having drinks with them, that type of thing. But each of them fundamentally wanted to get to know their athletes well so that they could better cater for their needs in terms of training, off-field stuff, but performance improvement as much as anything.
So before I move on, were there any other aspects of coaching philosophy that really stood out to you that you think would be really important for, I guess, coaches from a grassroots level all the way through to those elite coaches?
I think that person first mentality sums it up really well. Coach the person first and you'll get better outcomes for them as players. Because that kind of fundamentally creates a safer environment, I think, for people to learn in. And when people feel comfortable and safe and cared for, they're going to be more committed to learning and to probably what you've got to share with them in terms of your knowledge. And I don't think that matters whatever level you're at. I think that is something central, a central thread through all levels of coaching. Inherently personal pursuit coaching. It's about interaction. Yeah. That's front and foremost for me.
Okay, great. We're going to move on a little bit to some of the work you're doing at the moment. Obviously, you mentioned before you're at Western Sydney Uni, and you've been working really closely within the Aboriginal Australian Sports Coaches, some of which I'd love to have on the podcast at some stage. Tell me how you developed an interest in this area of coaching.
I think it was a personal choice because I got to a point where I realised that I didn't know as much as I really should about our history as a non-Indigenous fellow. And fortunately, I was able to sort of marry up this personal interest, pursuit, willingness, want to learn more about our First Nations people with sports coaching through my work. And effectively, I'd done a little bit of work with some great organisations like NASCAR, just volunteering, going away on some role model trips with them, tutoring through university with some great Indigenous students there. And effectively, all that I did was say to myself, all right, we're seeing, I like sport. There's lots of communication about how important sport is within First Nations communities. How can I learn about that more? How can I bring those two things together through work? So, alongside doing my own reading and trying to understand more about our history as a nation, I started to pay more attention to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's sporting context. And I guess if you look in the media, we hear lots about the championing of athletic success from within the community. The NRL's got 12% representation, probably more now. The AFL's got 13% of their professional players identify. And I thought that was awesome, but I also wondered why that wasn't translating into, in particular, the high performance context, more First Nations coaches in our professional leagues. And, in some ways that at the time might have been considered a sort of deficit perspective about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But the reality is the way that a lot of people tend to get those coaching jobs at the professional level is from being tapped on the shoulder. So they're an ex-professional player, they get tapped on the shoulder. You may have been a captain of the club, you're a good leader, you'd make a good coach. Here's a coaching appointment for you. And it was such a high proportion of players at that level, 10, 11%, compared to the population, general population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, about 3% of our Australian population. It was curious to me as to why there wasn't more presence among the community at that level. So I wanted to investigate, did some background work in terms of having a look at sports organisations and whether they offered coaching programs, pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in similar ways that they offered pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander athletes. And the AFL was the only one that offered a specific pathway for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches out of the 56 something sport organisations we've got in Australia. Then we went to the academic literature to find out whether people had ever spoken to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches and got their perspective about coaching itself. And we couldn't find any articles in academic literature that spoke to that. So the next logical step was to speak to coaches themselves, and with permission from community and some great support from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches, we managed to speak to 30 odd coaches about their pathways into coaching, why they started coaching, and then their views about how they coach, how they approach coaching. And I've been speaking for a while, but the most fascinating thing about speaking to these coaches was that even though I was doing it in 2015, so 10 years on from when I started my PhD, most of these coaches who coached at a variety of levels, from community level sport, their first year of coaching, men and women, people who were high performance coaches, the highest qualified coaches, coaching national teams, the fundamental principle with respect to the way that they approached their coaching was coach the person first, then the player. And it was an amazing light bulb moment for me because of the work I'd done 10 years earlier with professional coaches. And it just made me think to myself, we've missed a real trick here in not embracing our First Nations coaches more and supporting their interests, their capacity, this philosophy of coaching in terms of, progressing up to the professional level. And what I learned through the project was there's plenty of coaches from within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community giving up their time coaching in a community context, and that really strongly resonates with their fundamental beliefs about being relational and giving back to community, reciprocity. So they're always looking for a way that they can give back to their community, and but the progression up the pathway, the coaching pathway, just didn't seem to be happening. And they raised challenges that they'd faced with racism or feelings of invisibility, not being a safe place for them to learn, therefore to pursue these coaching interests, the weight of giving back to their community, all the other things that they were doing in their own worlds, successful academics, successful in their own employment, looking after a large family, sometimes living, intergenerationally and caring for daughters, their kids, so grandkids, all at the same time, even though they had this passion and interest in wanting to pursue coaching roles. So, it was a great project to be a part of, and I think, really, really awesome to hear that these coaches have this philosophy that matches what the highest level of coaches in the three sports, or coaches at that level in the professional context, were saying was their fundamental philosophy. So to me, again, that connects that point of, well, coaching is about people. So if we help people learn more about that connection, we might develop coaches a little bit better, maybe maintain them on the coaching pathway for a little bit longer.
Yeah, okay, great. So a lot of that research you've formulated and put into a book called Aboriginal Sports Coaches, Community and Culture. So for our listeners, can you give it a brief explanation of what the book's about and why you think it's important for our society?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of steps back from that. So in line with reciprocity and the importance of giving back to community, following our interviews, we made sure we shared their stories as widely as possible through a public community forum. We invited 5 of the coaches to speak, to share their stories with sports organisations, members of the general public, people who work in associations for sports and clubs, academics. And part of the intent of that is to make sure their voices are heard. But one of the recommendations that came from our interviews was to create opportunities for more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches to either enter the coaching pathway and become a part of the system. So before I said, we learned that a lot of people were giving up their time at the community level, but often they were working outside the accreditation system because there were barriers to get into the system, not a safe environment to learn, costly, not held in timely fashion, in the right location. And so they felt that if there were more opportunities provided to get into the pathway, what that would do is not only connect them to the system, which they're already operating in terms of coaching a team, but enable them to access formal accreditation, access resources that come with being an accredited coach, access information about coaching opportunities that might come up at higher levels and what you'd need to do to be a part of that. So based on the recommendation to create that opportunity, we developed with some of the coaches who took part in our interviews a steering committee, and then designed a coaching program called Coaching Unlimited, which was to partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and sports organisations to create a coach education workshop day that was specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so that the environment there was safe enough for them to enter, for those that wanted that element of cultural safety. And we created the day in a way that tried to meet cultural protocols and interests and needs. So we'd start the day out with acknowledgement or welcome to country, and then we'd invite an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coach to come and speak to the group about their experiences as an athlete transitioning into a coach and why they felt it was important to have more presence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coaches at any level. And then we'd go through coach education, and we'd sort of weave in some additional presentations in the afternoon from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health experts, academics, coaches, and non-Indigenous coaches, experts, academics, about topics of leadership, of mentoring, of nutrition, of health and well-being. We wanted to make the day more than just about coaching, because it also connected with their philosophy of, well, coach the person first, connect with the people, and then develop them as players. So from Coaching Unlimited, we've run a number of workshops. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that, again, as part of the process and importance of giving back to the community, we'd taken from them some knowledge, we'd learnt about their coaching experiences, and it was important to give back and create more space for them to learn. But the book came about simply from the interviews, and we put it together in a way that we wanted to ensure that the voices of the coaches we spoke to were at the forefront of what's in the book. So the interviews, which might have been 15,000 words, we managed to work with the coaches to bring down to 1,500 or 2,000 words. So each chapter is simply their story. We didn't want it to be an academic book where we're weaving in all sorts of theory and talking about lots of methodology that's in the book. It's the sort of front end and back end of the book. So it's there for people who are interested in how we went about the work we have. But fundamentally, the purpose of the book was to ensure that we were sharing the stories of the coaches in a way that they had spoken to us about, and in a way that really captured, the things that help them become coaches, the strengths that they have, their pathway into coaching, challenges they might have faced, and a little bit about, their approach to coaching and philosophy of coaching and way they operate. And it's the type of book that, you can pick up and read one chapter at a time. It doesn't have to be in order. You might pick the netball coach, you might pick then the rugby coach, and it's got, representation of coaches at lots of different levels. Fortunately, we didn't have that many women who gave their time to be able to speak. That reflects the nature of coaching in our society at the moment anyway. So it wasn't surprising. It was just, it would have been good to have more women in the book. But yeah, we tried to engage with people from a variety of different sports at different levels, coaching men and women. And for me, it's sort of the ultimate piece in learning about what it's like to coach from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander point of view, and something that hasn't really been shared before in accessible settings. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's not as accessible as it could be in terms of price by the publisher. But the stories themselves are great insights into who these people are and why they coach and what they value about it. So a great place to learn. How
do we go about getting our hands on a copy of the book?
Yeah, look, it's available online. Here's a picture of it. It's available online through Routledge, the publisher. You can buy it as an e-version. In fact, you can even buy chapters. If you prefer just to read about one specific coach, you can do that. We're certainly trying to work on prices coming down, but unfortunately, being set by the publisher, we don't have much control about that. And the libraries are purchasing the book if we've reached out to them to say, can you purchase this book? So maybe your local library might have it, and if it doesn't, you could ask them to order it. But yeah, if you want to engage in a little bit more understanding of our First Peoples through a sporting lens or sporting context, it's a good place to start, I think. And they're really, really wonderful stories, very consumable, short enough, to keep you interested, and definitely deep enough to give you that understanding and insight into what these people are like. Really, really wonderful human beings.
You're awesome. And you mentioned Coaching Unlimited. It's a program that you've been involved with. Just to give me a bit of a better understanding, does it work with multiple sports, or is it a completely separate organisation that you guys run your own coaching programs through? How does that work?
Yeah, initially I reached out to lots of different sports organisations, but what we learned is that some organisations are really well funded and kind of do their own thing. The AFL, NRL, they have departments that look after Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we tended to steer away from there. We've mainly worked with netball because they've been most in need, receptive, and a few of our coaches are very involved in netball. So they sort of were driving it, pushing for it. And that was great because, as an underfunded sport compared to a lot of other professional sports, but a really popular one, it was good to get involved from the angle of coaching. We've done a bit of work with football, but they now are starting to fund and invest more in First Nations spaces. So John Moriarty's a wonderful program that currently exists. And I know, the headquarters FFA have started to do much more in terms of coach development. So, they're doing the job, but we don't need to. But yeah, the goal at the moment is to keep working with netball. Happy to work with any sport, because basically we partner with the sports organisation to ensure that the coaches we work with and connect with in community get the same coach accreditation as everyone else and not treated differently. It's just we want to connect in a way that is a comfortable space for them to learn, more comfortable space for them to learn. And the reality is, if sports organisations that have become really serious about their connection with our First Peoples, then we become redundant as an organisation because it's part of their everyday business. And my simplistic view about it, without ever having worked in a sports organisation, is that if they transferred some of that focus and funding or budget from purely the athlete development context into supporting coaching, and that's in general, but more specifically in the First Nations context, then what we'll start to see is, with more coaches who are supported to progress, the more people that are visible in those roles who are hopefully positively influencing people in the community who are playing, and then the more people that they see who are coaching, the more likely it is people will stay in the sport and give back via coaching, which we know is a really influential role. And we'll see more people start to progress up the chain as well. So, in some ways, it's about taking seriously the funding of coaching, and particularly supporting First Nations people who've got that interest and investment and want to do it, so that we can see more coaches at all levels, but particularly the elite level. Ali Tucker-Munro is one of the coaches that we spoke to, a wonderful human being who's the only advanced or the highest level netball coach in Australia. She's an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman from Gamilaroi country up north, and she's actively and constantly seeking out people to join her in her journey up in the high performance world of netball coaching. And it's part of the reason we keep working with netball. We've connected at the foundation and development level, the 2 entry levels, but our steps this year are hopefully to work with some coaches who want to go from development to intermediate. That's the next level up and a bit of a more significant step. So we want to create a mentoring program to work with them throughout the season. That's what our steering committee's determined is the necessary next step for Coaching Unlimited to evolve. And it's great. It's tricky, but we've worked off a philanthropic donation twice to get us going, and funding is always the challenge to keep these things going beyond a term cycle, which is why I make the point about if sports organisations are serious, can they transfer some of their budget from one area to focus a little bit more on coaching and investing in our first peoples. Have a read of their stories in our book. You'll understand why they're worth investing in if you don't have that understanding already, or understanding of the history of Australia. So we hope to play a small role in contributing more to coach development within their community.
Yeah, awesome. Andrew, are there any sports that really stick out to you, or if you'd rather not say, that you'd love to get involved in with Coaching Unlimited?
No, I don't really mind. It doesn't matter to me what sport. Again, I think that sports that are already doing similar things or working and have some connection with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, our role is not to play a part in that as much as other organisations that have fractious relationships or haven't done much, or do not have the funding, time and energy to commit to coaching at the moment. We can be that centerpiece. But again, we're working off small budget, no staff, and so we can only do so much, which is why there's been a strong focus on netball at the moment. There's a need there. We've got a good relationship with netball. They're interested. There's some strong people driving it on our steering committee, like Ali Tucker-Munro and Georgina Cohen, both who've got long-standing relationships with netball, particularly in New South Wales. But we'd really like to expand. We'd like to attract more in terms of funding to roll out a nationwide coach mentoring program, and also to do the research behind it. So part of our goal is to try and create a program that might be funded, driven by a community, but might be funded by ARC level grants, and or continue to attract people who are willing to donate to what we do, so we can fundamentally continue to just support our First Nations coaches in accruing accreditation where they desire. So there's a couple of different ways we could go, we'd like to go, but with more time and energy, I think we'll get there. It's just at the moment it's small, very small scale. It's New South Wales based now. We're pretty much sport, but there's absolutely no reason why we can't work with other sports who might be interested.
If someone wanted to get in touch with you guys, what's the best way? Website? How could people get in contact and find out a bit more about Coaching Unlimited?
Yeah, Coaching Unlimited has a website and a Twitter and Facebook page. It's coachingunlimitedaustralia.com.au, and that website's got the Twitter handle and the Facebook page. Otherwise, I've got a Facebook page that connects to that. Or you can reach out to me at work through my work email, a.bennie@westernsydney.edu.au. We do have a contacts part of the website on the Coaching Unlimited page. That works too. Always happy to hear from people. We always go where we're invited to work with First Nations communities. So that's the best driver for us. And we've been sort of stymied in the past 2 years not being able to get into communities through COVID. But we're back up and running this year. And when the time's right, we'll get started with community-based coach education courses again.
Awesome. If someone's keen to donate to the program, how can they go about doing that? To just contacting you, or is there a link on the website?
Yeah, there's a webpage through Western Sydney Uni through the giving site, but probably best to get in touch with me. I can pass on the link. I don't think we've got the link on the website, which I could probably address as soon as we're off this chat. People can donate small, large amounts, all tax deductible. So that, through Western Sydney, we allocate the funds directly to the coaching program from now on.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. It's very much appreciated. I want to wish you all the best. And for anyone who's interested in the Coaching Unlimited program or who want to get their hands on the book, I'll add some links into the show notes.
It was always a pleasure to join.
Some of the key takeaways for me were that first and foremost, coaches at the professional level focus far more on player management and developing a positive team culture than the techniques, tactics and strategies of the sport. While tactics and wins and losses were considered important, effective professional coaches prioritised athletes' needs. This connected with a person-centred leadership style that focuses on people rather than player-first mentality to cultivate a positive learning environment and manage the ups and downs that occur throughout a season. And while professional sports coaches do have more time to get to know their athletes, community coaches can still prioritise time in their 1 to 2 training sessions per week to learn about their playing group on an individual level and to get to know what types of activities they like practicing so they can understand what makes them tick and set athletes up to really enjoy their sports participation. As we changed the topic and began discussing Andrew's collaborative work with Aboriginal Australian sports coaches, it was interesting to hear that within this community there was an inherent belief of coaching the person first before the athlete across all levels, regardless of whether the coaches were working with under sixes or elite athletes in professional contexts. Interestingly, this culturally driven approach to coaching also tied in very closely with what he discovered years earlier when researching effective coaching in professional sports contexts. Andrew co-authored the book titled Aboriginal Sports Coaches, Community and Culture, which shares the stories of coaches in many sports. It elaborates on the strengths, the philosophies, the pathways into coaching and the challenges along the way. Andrew, with his First Nations colleagues and National Sports Organisation contacts, are creating opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sports coaches to gain formal accreditation in a culturally safe format through the Coaching Unlimited program. I've put links to the Coaching Unlimited website in the show notes, as well as links to Andrew's book. Reach out to him if you're interested in finding out more or sharing these opportunities with any of your contacts. And finally, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your colleagues and your friends.